it's a goal. Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
Hello everyone. So what a weekend. The sun shone, the Sunday roast was cooked to perfection, and football was entertaining. And also, FPL wise, we're suddenly both blessed with one of those letter-spotted green arrows to take us into the international snooze break. And because we've got a couple of weeks to reflect, we decided this pod would be just that, a bit of a step back. More in a sec. I'm Tom, I'm here with a beer, yay! And I'm joined by Sam as always. You alright?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Like you say, it was nice to actually finally get a green arrow, my very first of the season. So I am sorry if I'm a little bit too jubilant today. But yeah, nice to actually stop the rot for a bit. Got out of the house and made some gin over the weekend, which was good fun. And then had a really nice Sunday roast whilst I watched my captain bag a brace. So no complaints from me whatsoever. But yeah, we are Who Got the Assist. The second final time we're going to be promoting the mini league. We're leaving it open until game week 10. So that mini league code, if you do want to get involved, is MINLUD. So do make sure you get in during the international break. I think we're going to leave it open one final week after that. So make sure you get involved very quickly. On today's pods, we are going to spend a brief moment to feel happy about my first green arrow of the season, and Tom, I think you're second in a row as well. So you're making good steps at the moment. We're going to leave contemplate for this week because we're going to do a second pod during the international break next week. And instead, we'll take a little bit of a zoom out and an audit on the season so far, those first 8 game weeks. What have we learned from those 8 game weeks so far? And answer the question, if we were burying a time capsule for ourselves to pick up in a year's time in game week 8 next year, what would we tell ourselves about the opening weeks? We're going to skip over bold claims for this week and we'll tackle them next week. October the 9th is the date today. The fixtures are all done for the game week. So these are final scores. Back over to you, Tom.
Yes, indeed. It's my daughter's 6-month birthday today as well. So, yes, a very memorable day. So, yes, let's have a look on scores on the doors. Yes, as Sam said, try not to be too overly jubilant. I know those people did not have the week that we did, just because I think that we managed to pull the captaincy out the bag, didn't we? So, wildcard, Sam spoke about that last week. This team looks it's up on YouTube for those listening, but this team looks pretty much the one that you talked me through, isn't it? I mean, I think there's Gerd was the one that kind of came in late on, but overall quite a good week for you.
Yeah, I was very happy with it. Spent most of the week deliberating, but I think the team I got to about Tuesday or Wednesday evening was very close to the team I finished on. I was just debating that fourth and fifth midfielder spot and the fourth defender. In the end, I went with Haaland and Salah. I know quite a few people on Wildcard didn't go with Haaland, which is obviously a topic for debate. I went with both of them. I went with Bowen as my fourth midfielder, with Anthony Gordon nestled snugly on my bench to come back in game week 9 as a bit of a differential. I thought that would set me a little bit aside from regular wildcarders in game week 8. But I still think he was bought by a fair few people. So we'll watch out for that next week. Instead, I started Archer, which was a row call. He only got 2 points, so nothing from him. And again, like you said, on the bench, he'll be first bench for the first couple of weeks and then probably comes in when West Ham's fixtures turn for the better. And I think that he's going to find himself on the end of a few James Ward-Prowse crosses here and there. So I'm hoping I can sneak a goal out of him at some point. But yeah, the big story of the week and the wild card for me was captaining Salah. 30 points, very happy with that. Everywhere else, there were a couple of assists here and there for Maddison and Watkins. Turner in goal got the clean sheet, and the doggy got 6 points at the back. But nothing too crazy outside of Salah, but it really did all hinge on the fact that there were 3 main captaincy options and all had their own merits, and we, I guess, happened to pick the correct one. And so, yeah, 65 points, green arrow up to just outside the top million now from 2.3 million. So much happier going into the international break.
Lovely stuff. Yeah, no, very, very good. It's always nice to have that big boost, isn't it, just after the wild card is played. And I guess the secret is that the more red arrows you get, the likelier you are to have a massive green. Oh, so such a shame you didn't quite get into the six figures, right? I mean, you think it was just that. I guess it must have been kind of a few rogue people having Arsenal assets potentially come off the bench, defenders, and maybe appearance for Alvarez, but there's not very much there at all, is there really? That's must be at 1 point more, and you'd have gotten the six figures. So yeah, very, very good, and team looks very solid going forward. So yeah, I in the end I got 64 and -4. Similar to you, similar story. Some only returns were a Trippier assist. He got an assist and 2 bonus and 2-2, which is quite good. Porro cleaning could have been a lot more, and Turner cleaning. But yeah, it was all about the armband, all about Salah, and hit me up that 64. So last week I was discussing moving on Botman to cash, which I did do, and then I was also kind of mooting going from Alvarez to Watkins. I'll admit we did the poll about FOMO not very long ago, but I'll admit that I did get the FOMO a little bit about Spurs. I kind of felt with that Luton game that and Fulham up next as well after international break, that I wanted to buy a ticket in the lottery. And buying cash meant that I didn't have the necessary leftover to move Diaby up to Maddison, and I was initially talking about obviously moving Bowen on for Maddison, but I recounted on that a little bit because of how well he played the first week I had him against Sheffield United, and just in general how much to the eye he'd been quite impressive. And I think it all kind of came back to me a little bit, and the data as well we'll speak about later again is fairly good for Bowen. And so I kind of thought, you know what, I've got to move on the RB, I think, here, just because I thought it was a decent. It was a kind of 50-50-ish that he was going to play, so I thought, it would have been a case of worst case scenario, get the RB sort of off the bench 1 point, or maybe not at all, and I've got like Charlie Taylor or Kabore coming on, or I buy another lottery ticket, take the hit, got to choose between Kulusevski and Richarlison for that. Got pretty lucky to the tune of 2 points that I didn't choose Richarlison because he got sub mid half time, just because of X red card, which again has reared its ugly head where in terms of early transfers in. But yeah, Kulusevski lottery ticket basically. Strike saved, and Richarlison really should have scored an assist from him. Not really asset, I'm gonna have to say, from watching the game. But there we go. One more week and then move on. It was just a lottery ticket basically in the game, and maybe it will come off against Fulham. But if not, a player to be sold in game week 10 to move Alvarez up to Watkins. And in retrospect, maybe I should have just got Watkins in. But as I said, I still stand by doing that move without knowing what I know now. Very unlucky with Porro. I'm going to say from a Son assist too, very early on in the first half. Yeah, all about captain. And when Son blanked Sam, I think we were both kind of quietly confident. And then I said to you, I think must have been kind of early on in the game, probably about 20-30 minutes in it. Where are the points? What's happened, Sam? Literally
within 5 minutes. Yeah.
Fair points, Tom. He's written in capital letters. So it's really nice. I think Salah was like 40% effective ownership, which is just crazy. I mean, it's so good when things go your way, and I'm aware that hasn't gone your way. It may not have gone your way if you're listening this week, but it will do at some point in the season. And it's just great. It just makes your day, makes your weekend, and it's so nice to going into national break with a nice green arrow. So more than half my rank from kind of 900-ish K to 474K exactly, 000. I don't think we've ever had that before. So yeah, that's cool. So yeah, all looking quite rosy in the garden. Right, so yes, it's a bit of a different pod this week, just because, as Sam mentioned, we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at the opening 8 weeks and figure out, I suppose, if there's any lessons we can take away from what's transpired. And as mentioned, Sam, it's a bit like we're burying a time capsule in the garden, and just to kind of inform ourselves next year, game week 1, what pre-game week 1 indeed, what could we do over the first 8 weeks? So what do the first 8 weeks feel like? What lessons do we learn from them? So we'll dig it up at the start of next season in order to inform us on the opening stages of next year and how we think that might go. given the rate I'm going through co-host, so I assume that'll be me and my AI companion by that point. But hopefully it will be you two. But yes, I think we'll try to gather some stuff together. We'll try to summarize at the end. But more than anything, this is more of a kind of a free-form discussion of how the season's opened and potentially what we've learned. Because a lot of the time, I think in FPL, you cycle through, don't you? And everything kind of blurs into one. If someone asked me kind of what was going on Game Week 8 last season, I'd have no idea, frankly. I can't remember. But I think it's just important to kind of just spend a moment thinking about this, especially now we've got luxury of a week off of the football. So I mean, starting off, I think something that kind of comes to mind for me is just to reiterate the fact that we know nothing at the start of the season. I mean, this has been your first sort of pre-season cycle, hasn't it? Now we're kind of looking back on it. It was your first pre-season cycle. And I guess we had to say stuff. I mean, it's definitely something we've mentioned across the history of WGTA. But I mean, in today's kind of super saturated content market, you've got to have an opinion about stuff pre-season. Like, you can't come out and really and say, oh, I don't know. I guess you can, but you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you say I don't know, people are like, well, why would I listen to you? You have no opinions about anything, blah blah blah. And if you do say stuff, then you're open to ridicule. But I think it's important to reiterate that at the start of the season, it's difficult to really know what's going to happen. And if we were negative, for example, mostly about the pricing structure, making things potentially a bit too easy. And I don't know, what do you think about that? Do you think it's something which is important to bear in mind at the start of next year? I'm not saying that we do the preseason going, oh, yeah, we don't know. Fall over in 5 minutes. The prices look all right, but I've got no idea. But I mean, I think that's still important to underline, right?
Yeah, so I think I'll break it down into two parts. To start with, on pricing, I think because we only had 2 proper premiums that we were interested in this season, then I think it was a fair assumption to say that, well, actually, we probably can afford most of these players and the pricing is a little bit cheap. But as soon as you do want those 2 premiums, and then you also want your Sakas and your Son as well, has sort of happened to come out of the woodwork at 9 million as well. A lot of these players are on the upper side of the mid price, so jamming in all of them is quite difficult. And there will always be that temptation to try and like maximize the amount of value you can get out of your team and almost like bring it up to that 102 million budget around game week 8 or 9. So I guess that was a little bit ignorant on our part, that we thought just pricing would never matter when Liverpool's fixtures were staring us in the face. At some point we were going to want to get across to Salah, and all it would have then taken is that a Spurs asset or a Man United asset or even an Arsenal asset to really become prevalent in all of our teams. And then all of a sudden it's quite a lot of money spent on 3, maybe 4 players, and the rest becomes very tight around the edges. So yeah, that's something to maybe remember moving forwards, not even just next season as well, but later on this season, there will be a point where a lot of us will probably look at taking Salah out again, or maybe some of us are taking out Haaland, for instance, as well. There will undoubtedly be another point when we hop back onto a combination of 2 plus a third sort of mid to higher priced asset, and then the pricing will get tight again. So I think it's just something for us to remember down the line later in the season, that okay, don't make a million early moves just to chase the prices, but just keep it in the back of your mind that it probably will be of importance at some point. There was a draft I was looking at that I was 0.1 shy of this week, that I think in the end it actually wouldn't have done any better, but it looked better to my eye, and it just reminded me straight up, like maybe I should have just made an early move on 1 or 2 players and I'd be there right now. So yeah, living a little bit on the edge sometimes does pay off, and I'm such a conservative manager that I probably won't heed my own warning here.
No,
but if I was talking to future Sam right now, it's like, yeah, come on, like if they don't have a midweek European fixture, just make the transfer, mate. Like just get it done. If you're that confident, then just once or twice a season could make the difference between you affording a draft and not affording a draft.
I need to get a soundbite of you saying that.
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Oh, man,
I
really...
won't remind you of this after the show, so you're going to have to remember it. But I guess the second point was about like what we've learned so far, and I think you summed it up really nicely. I made a little note before the show because I knew this question was coming, and the way I'd summarize it is accepting our own ignorance. And I think there are just so many so many factors that change between seasons that all we've got to go on before the season starts is what we saw the previous seasons and assumptions that we're making based on transfers and new managers coming in and play styles, that kind of thing. But they are just assumptions. We're equating what's happened in the past and adding on all of these various factors that we don't have any objectivity to because we've never seen them play out in real life. And then we're making assumptions based on that. So I think there's a much wider margin for error at the start of any season than there is at any other point, especially 8 weeks in when we've got some data that we can, it's not long-term data, but we can start mapping out a bit of a picture of what's going on this season and what the story and the narrative of this season might be. So yeah, I think it's just not to do preseason podcasts where we're saying we don't know anything, but it's just being open to the idea that we're going things that we think are almost certain, i.e. Rashford and Bruno hitting the ground running, just as an example, or Martinelli being a fantastic value pick. He still might be eventually, by the way, but all of these things are open for debate, even if we feel like they aren't. And something as certain as even Haaland being in everyone's team come game week 8 has been questioned slightly by some this week. And we're only 8 weeks into the season. So things change very, very quickly. And I think it's more likely to change when we've had that pre-season and we've had that break between years where the data that we're looking at is just that little bit old. And it's also less useful because other things have changed. New managers have come in, new players have come in, new players have left. So yeah, accept our own ignorance to a certain degree and understand that we are going to make assumptions, but they are less accurate than maybe they would normally be in any given like mid-season game week.
Yeah, because I mean, you're all saying that price doesn't matter, but price doesn't matter until it does.
Yeah.
You know? And then suddenly you're like, oh crap, putting the wild card together and you're thinking, oh my, as you said, 0.1 million, that's all it was. And it was me kind of thinking, oh, I need to wait till Friday for a move I knew I was going to make on Sunday. No midweek games. I should have done that because then I could afford a slightly better player in there. But you're completely right about ignorance and making sure that you're embracing it to some extent. Like, I think there's definitely a tendency to act like you know it all and kind of try to project that sense of being an authority. But I think you're still kind of, I guess, perpetually a bit of a student of what FPL is, because it does change a lot. As you said, there's players, there's managers, there's system changes that occur. And you've even got kind of things like, certain players just suddenly not seeming quite up for it, or something being wrong, a player carrying an injury you don't know anything about. So you might think, you mentioned Rashford earlier, he's a very good example of an individual like that, because last year I think he was 5th overall, I'm going to say. I think it was in the top 5. He certainly was in the 200 club. And at the start of the season, I don't think, I'm not saying that I would go back to the start of the season and say I was wrong to start with Rashford. However, it's one of those things where you've got to be more mindful of the fact that I think I held him a little bit too long, and maybe it was a case of kind of trusting my eyes a bit more on him than perhaps I did, just because I was kind of blinded by the fixtures a little bit. I don't know. And I think you were right as well about the data being slightly old. And I think to add to that, you remember last season so much when you're at the beginning of the new season, and you kind of, it's necessary. It's what you do. It's availability heuristic, remembering the most sort of easily accessible memory. But I think trying to throw the shackles off a little bit and trying to be open to the fact that things may not proceed as they did last season, although we'll get into this a little bit later, maybe that this is a bit of an oxymoron to say that all of the players last season are not going to perform again. That's certainly not true. But being open to that fact is something which is interesting. I mean, I do wonder whether, we were fairly damn template, weren't we, early doors? And we know the risks of that. Like, we know the risks of going against that, because if the template, we've had a couple of years in the past where the template has smashed it really early on, and if you weren't on that train, you were like playing catch up from the outset. That's what happened last year, for example. I know to a lot of people, we didn't have Haaland game week 1 and didn't have Jesus. I think Adam Pritchard didn't have Jesus, and then 19 points game week 2, and then suddenly, okay, I need to kind of recalibrate very quickly. But do you think that there's more scope to be puntier early, or would you always be kind of looking at safety still?
Yeah, I think it depends on your temperament as a manager. I've seen managers kick off a season with 3 or 4 really punty picks that they've got a bit of a gut feeling on, and it will just kick off for them, and you'll get them off to a flyer. But equally, the same way you only hear about a gambler when they're winning, you only really hear about an FPL manager who's doing those punts when they're doing well, usually. And I think there's a lot of managers out there who will be taking those punts at the start of the season that maybe we don't hear because they haven't been as successful. And I think just to add to that as well, the template at the start of the season tends to be the template because they're a selection of players that the most people have the most underlying confidence in. That will be partly because of the data in the previous seasons, maybe because of a narrative that's formed over pre-season as well. But the safety of it isn't necessarily the fact that they're owned by everyone. It's the fact that, for me anyway, that I've got the most confidence in those players and their quality based on what I know at that point and the data available. Rashford, I think we're going to keep coming back to him, I think, as a bit of a theme of the pod, but all of the data that we had on him, and based on what we saw in terms of the preseason and what was changing at Man United, nothing there made me feel like factors were preventing him from having another season like he was going to have. I didn't see anything fundamentally change over preseason that made me think, well, Rashford's going to go off the boil. But one thing maybe I should have taken more notice of is he is quite a historically streaky player and a confidence player. And maybe all it would take is 1 or 2 matches where he's not looking quite at it to then think, okay, I don't have this confidence in Marcus Rashford at the moment as it is anyway. Again, because he's a confidence player, he could bag a brace against Sheffield United and all of a sudden we're all flocking to him again. And we need to be open to that as well.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think fundamentally at the start of the season, it is a bit of a lottery, and some more expressive or aggressive managers will have a couple of punts that will pay off really well. And I think those are the players that are actually even more likely to win FPL by the end of the season because they can ride a wave early. But it's knowing not to do too many of those just for the sake of it. You've got to balance it out, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, it's getting that balance right to just play on that word a little bit, isn't it? Because I think it's all well and good us I'm sure some people may be thinking 8 weeks on, you're basically just saying, oh yeah, no, you should have known that a couple of these players were absolute duds, or have been duds thus far. But it is difficult to know exactly when, you should be kind of saying to yourself, you know what, okay, I've had enough here. And you still had decentish fixtures for Rashford on paper. You had the Wolves game, obviously, to start the season, which was, okay, you probably were right with that, thinking it'll be okay. The Spurs game, you're thinking, yeah, okay. And then 3 and 4, I think it was Nottingham Forest, there's a 2 assists, something like that. I think he got, and he scored that goal against Arsenal. And you're thinking, right, okay, next 2, 3, Brighton, Burnley, Crystal Palace.
It teased you into keeping him,
exactly, and that's when the eye test is really important, isn't it? And I think that's kind of what I think lacks a little bit sometimes, especially when you look at, I love the models, don't get me wrong, and I love the models with complete respect to the analytics crew, all stuff like that. But there is certainly a semblance of, how long can you go just trusting the numbers when you've got limited data? And I think with players like that, especially when there's other options which are doing well. You mentioned kind of, not having Salah game week 1. If with Salah's crazy kind of consistency when he wasn't in many people's teams, and he's still kind of relatively a differential. I don't think I think kind of spoke to us 2 years ago, you wouldn't have been thinking that, Salah would be kind of 30-40% captaincy on a week like this week when there's a split pin. With all those other options we could have gone for, it's just kind of trying to get that balance right in terms of when you do move off a player. I mean, are there any indications other than the eye? I don't think so, are there? It is about kind of having the integrative approach to kind of saying, right, okay, the data is okay for Rashford. It's still okay. I think he's, I looked at it before, I think he's in the top 20 or something like that for a non-pen SGI this season. So it's not terrible. It's just that if you add that to watching them play and watching him play in particular, and what you know about the streakiness, as you said, there probably is a point when you kind of say, you know what, I've seen enough. And for me, that was game week 7 when I wildcarded. I'd seen enough. I didn't want them anymore, regardless of the fact they had Palace next, who were always a bit of a bogey team for them anyway. But that was kind of, by the by. Any kind of key performance indicators, KPIs that you're going to be taking from this, either going forward or maybe next year into the craziness of the early season?
Yeah, I think the lesson I've probably learned this season, and I probably should have learned it quite a few seasons ago, is analysing each of the picks at the start of the year. Why am I picking this guy? What factors combine to make this player a good FPL asset? Like, what are the underlying reasons behind the fact that Erling Haaland scores 30 plus goals in a season? Well, part of that is probably the build-up play. It's probably the players around him. It's the way the system works for him. Probably a better example would be wing backs in a Chelsea system, for instance. Like, what makes them good FPL assets? Well, if they're not injured, for one, that would be a good start. The fact that they are playing 5 at the back, not 4 at the back, that will hamper them. So it's basically like a tick box exercise. What factors do I believe are going to change going into this season? Or what would I need to see from the first 2 or 3 game weeks to think, right, something has changed here to make this player either more or less of a fantasy pick than what we're used to? So, for example, Son moving to centre forward to the number 9 role is a huge, big green tick to, okay, this is a changing factor that we need to assess. And I think there are a few other good examples from this year, but it also works in the other way. Like Marcus Rashford, again, for instance, there are a number of factors that make him a good fantasy pick. Have any of these factors shifted in the opening few game weeks? I think arguably a number of them probably have. One is a subjective one, and that is confidence. And it's hard to tell whether a player is playing with confidence, but I think in his case, he kind of wears it on his sleeve a little bit. And you can kind of tell when his head's down rather than he's feeling the rhythm of the game. And I think it's just one of those where maybe that subjective opinion on a player can pay off. But yeah, I mean, that I would almost go through it like a tick box exercise. What factors are the same? What are changing? What could make them a better or a worse pick based on those factors going into the new season?
Absolutely. I'll tell you what, though. I think one thing that I've I'm not doing particularly well, but one thing that I do think has kind of changed this season, and one thing that I think I do try to incorporate most seasons, is kind of the idea that every season there are these sort of things which change with the season that we've mentioned. They give each season its own sort of unique character, which I really like about FPL. That's one of the reasons that keeps me coming back. And I think that with every season having its own kind of character, your play style can also adapt too. So last year, I felt. Do you remember? I think you were kind of part of this sort of movement as well. But we kind of got to a certain point in the early season. It might have been around game week 7 or game week 8, where people were literally burning transfers. Moving around 4.5 million forwards. Just to not burn a transfer. And just because last year, I think the early kind of template setup
was very strong.
It was just so easy. It was so easy, and it was. I don't know whether it was because it was me doing a kind of happened upon a decent sort of setup early doors. It feels very different to kind of where we are now. And I guess taking in that sort of difference is really important as well, because if you kind of say, hey, this year that there is a lot more sort of scope to moving things around because the pricing is leveled out. There's a lot more sort of interchangeable parts that you can mess around with depending on the week, and kind of you're basically just buying a lottery ticket. Whereas last year, we kind of got to the point where, I don't know, like game week, I think it was game week sort of 7-ish. No, that was when the Queen died. Game week sort of 5, 6, 7. I do remember that it was just sitting around kind of just, what do I do? There's nothing I can possibly do. And I think that that kind of presages a slight difference in how you play things. And looking at kind of some of the top managers this year who are doing really well, I know that a lot of sort of longer term good managers aren't doing as well as they'd like to be. Man FPL said that he always used to be team patience, but he's swinging towards kind of gut picks, quicker moves. Where are you on the spectrum at the minute? I think that that's kind of a really important sort of point, because we floated the idea on this pod a couple of times about kind of leave your defenders, leave your strikers, and mess around with midfielders, because there's just so much choice there. Maybe kind of it's still sort of the case with the midfielder, with the strikers as well, even though I don't know, maybe Alvarez, Watkins, and Haaland is a free that those people are going to be sticking with. But I mean, do you think this season's different from last in terms of character? And as Man FPL says, do you think there is more scope to be more promiscuous, I suppose, with the moves you're making?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a great part of a season's character can come from whether or not the initial template, as it were, proves to be successful or not. I think a lot of what happened last year, especially in the early weeks, before, obviously, as you mentioned, the Queen passing around game week 7 or game week 8, that shifted things. And then that became its own character around more double game weeks came in, more blanks came in, and a lot shifted around that. But for the first few game weeks, the template was incredibly strong for a lot of people. So the character of the season was patience, because things were working. You didn't want to like go too aggressive because you're almost taking out a good asset for the sake of it at that point. And a lot of people were moving too early and getting burnt because the players that they were taking out were still going to continue performing. This season, I think the lion's share of players who I know and respect in the community and have been playing for a long, long time have been a little bit burnt by the fact that some picks that we had quite a lot of confidence in haven't performed to the level that we thought they would. And therefore, on average, the ranks are a little bit lower for the people that historically have taken the game very seriously. Now, that's not to say the people doing well at the moment don't take the game seriously at all. It's just the players that I think have been playing 5-6 years and have been on Twitter or X seem to be doing probably on average a lot worse. And I think it in part is to do with the fact that the template was not strong at the start of the season whatsoever. And the players that we maybe thought we had good reason to have confidence in haven't been quite the players we thought they were. So I think that shaped the character of this season so far. And if we were to take it in chunks, last season we could do that really easily because there was that middle wild card. I know it wasn't called a wild card, but in the middle of the season around the World Cup, where a lot of people were breaking into quarters of a season. And so each quarter felt like it had its own unique flavor to it. This season, I think the overall sense I'm getting is that it's going to be a bit of a grind from now until game week 23, 24, when we're looking at maybe next wildcarding. A lot of managers have already used their wildcard. I think it's 42%. I think above average FPL was saying the other day, in the top 1 million have used their wildcard already. So, and quite a lot of managers, even in the top million, probably will forget to play FPL by around game week 15, 16 and forget to play their wildcard whatsoever. So a lot of managers have already used it. So we've got a long grind now all the way through to the next wild card. So patience will probably come into it a little bit more now than it has done up until now. But I still think there's plenty of room for those aggressive moves, especially in midfield at the moment, because there are a lot of players kind of clumped together around that 7 to 8 million mark that each will have upside in various different weeks. And I think there are 3 or 4 really targetable teams this season that you want to be having at least one upside pick against: the Sheffield Uniteds, the Burnleys, the Lutons, the Bournemouths as well, and possibly even the Fulhams as well. So any of those games, you might want to have the it midfielder for, or the it striker for. And especially in midfield, because we've got 5 spots up for grabs, 4 plus Salah for us probably for the foreseeable, then I think there is room to hop on those really nice fixture patches and be aggressive with those moves for the next few weeks, and maybe just leave the moves in defense and possibly even up front for a little while now, because they'll just tick over quite nicely.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely an interesting kind of time, because I remember like 3-5-2, for example, is a good kind of point to just mention though, because you said obviously you got the it midfielder each week, and with the fact with the pricing kind of being as it was, and the fact that there are loads of players that they kind of declined to move around, or whatever, the 5-man midfield just creates that sort of flexibility to be really, really punty, I think. I mean, there is kind of a semblance of long-term plan. As you said, there's players like Salah who is going to probably leave there for now. We'll talk about him next week, that's for sure. Like so Son, almost definitely probably kind of staying. Maybe we would like a United or Arsenal player to step forward. I mean, I think Arsenal will kind of, by game week 10, again, herald us with lots of interest. Martinelli, of course, back, scoring the winner. I woke my daughter up after he scored that. But, who will kind of present themselves as options, but having all those sort of options there to move around, it feels a lot more like I look at my team, look at the midfield this at the moment, Bowen, Gordon, Kulusevski, Salah, Son, and I know that Kulusevski is like not long for this world. Like, his head's firmly on the chopping block, waiting for the axe to fall. Gordon, who knows? Could stay there for a long time. Could be shipped out for Pedro Neto at some point soon. Bowen, I mean, I'm hoping that he comes good. He obviously scored for me the first week. Fixtures get very good from game week 10 all the way into December, so could be a long termer. But I've got a slightly less confidence, I guess, than I did kind of last year when I was looking at this to some extent. And I also kind of look back to last year in terms of the transfers that I was making, and this year it has been a lot about, as you said, buying that midfielder every week to try to kind of steal in and kind of get points. Even up to last week, buying Kulusevski to buy a ticket in the lottery because there's a targetable team at the other end for Spurs, which was, of course, Luton, and Fulham next week. So, that's a great pair of back-to-back fixtures. Could get 2 blanks, or I could, get 1 bang, could even get 2 explosions. It's definitely worth it. And that being there to answer Man FPL's question just makes me think I've kind of gone. I'm all in on this sort of gut picks, quicker move sort of thing, trying to steal a march on people. Just say that last season, I did have a look at it before the pod. By this point, if we add on an extra week, because obviously one of the weeks was a no-go, I think I'd made 5 transfers by game week 9 last season, and all of those transfers were just basically pissing around. So it was stuff like moving out Reece James for Cucurella. Do you remember when Reece James got injured that one week? Or
yeah.
And then the next week, Reece James was back. Cucurella was rubbish, so I bought James back again. That was one of the transfers I made. That's 2 transfers made there. And the other thing I did was moving the cheap slot in midfield around. So I moved Bailey, who I started with, to Aronson. I moved him onto Ezzy. It was kind of just nonsense. Rearranging the decks on the decks on the Titanic as it was sinking, sort of thing. Nothing. Whereas this year, all the transfers have been very much targeted at, all right, I'm going to try to just hope that I bang this week with a certain player or a certain pick. And that's kind of, I guess, a demonstrable difference of what's been going on this year. Stuff like bringing in Son for Foden, stuff like bringing in Sterling for Matoma, stuff like bringing in, Foden for Martinelli. Like I bought Foden in game week 4 and sold him in game week 5. Like last year, that would have been unthinkable. But this year, it's one of those so far, and I really enjoy it, where there is this sort of element of, okay, all right, I can buy this player in. Because there's so many options, the EO is so sort of evaporated. It's not really going to hurt you too much to be selling individual players. I mean, okay, at certain points, players like Mbumo were up there in terms of overall ownership. You're probably not going to be selling the likes of Salah at the moment. Even selling like Bruno and Rashford at points was kind of quite scary. I mean, Rashford was over 50% owned at some point, but Saka's injuries come at a good time. Obviously, we still won without him. I wouldn't say that if we'd have lost against City, but come at a good time. Now his kind of overall ownership amongst the engaged core is dropping. Matoma, I think, is still holding out around kind of 40%, but again, with the engaged lot, looking at live FPL, not that bad. So, having all these options means that overall the effective ownership is also quite low, which then enables you to kind of go, fine, I'm going to sell this player that, yes, in latter seasons, I've kept them for a little bit, given them that sort of 5-week, 6-week horizon. That is kind of the received way of playing. But this year, why not? Why not go for it? I really like it. I've really enjoyed this year so far, I'd say. But in terms of time capsule for next year, I think it is kind of coming back to the idea that every season's different. Adapt your play style. And I think, Sam, after 8 weeks, we're okay to kind of say we've got an okay grasp on how the season looks. So do you think eight weeks is enough, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, I think 8 weeks is a decent enough sample size, and I know in an analytics sense, it's definitely not a long enough sample size. We really need to see each team play each other at least once before we've got a real grasp on it. But with that in mind, the fact that that's almost impossible to do, especially if they play each other twice, and we want that home and away combo to really feel out what the season's looking like, then by the time we get that, the season's over. So we need to start making some assumptions based on the data we've got. And 8 weeks, I think there are certain trends that we can definitely start picking out. We'll look at the expected data in just a second. There are definitely trends that have continued from last season, but also some that have come out of seemingly nowhere or disappeared out of seemingly nowhere that we can probably have relatively decent amounts of confidence in continuing. Spurs, for example, look like a completely different side. I'd be very surprised if they didn't continue generating a decent amount of XG in most matches. But on the other side, City maybe look ever so slightly more conservative than they have been previously. So yeah, I think there are moving parts, moving chess pieces, and after 8 weeks, I think I'm starting to get a bit of a grasp on what those might be. But yeah, I mean, the more game weeks we have under our belt, the more confident we'll become, right?
Yeah, I mean, are we just saying that after gathering early green arrows and something? You've got a spring in our step, and then game week, next week's pod, we're like, oh shit, we've absolutely got this wrong.
Yeah,
should have just kept the faith all along. I think you had a good idea, didn't you, for what to do next? So there's a comparison between kind of the top 10 non-pen XGI so far this season and where we're kind of where we are. Versus last season. Obviously, a bit of a fun exercise. Yes, 8 weeks in. I know that a lot of the stats purists are going to be decrying us and being very upset about this, but I think it's still worth kind of mentioning very quickly and kind of seeing what we notice. So I guess kind of the overall rundown is kind of I mean, I'll read them and then we can comment on them afterwards. In terms of the top 10 for non-pen XGI this season, obviously Erling Haaland's on top, followed by Mo Salah. In third is Ollie Watkins. And I remember a few weeks back, Sam, I was saying, yeah, Ollie Watkins is fifth. And you're like, really? Really? He's still there? We should keep him. And we should have kept him, shouldn't we, really?
probably.
Yeah, in the fourth, it's Bruno Fernandes. So yes, one who has escaped scrutiny. We've spoken about Rashford a little bit, but Bruno still put the numbers up. Son is camped out in fifth, and Abdoulaye Doucouré in sixth. Sam, wow, a bit of an interesting glue guy there, the Duke.
Very interesting.
He's actually in joint sixth with Alexander Isak on 4.7 and James Maddison, Nick Jackson. Should be saying sorry. Sorry, 4.6, and then finally Jared Bowen rounding off the top 10. Some names that you'd kind of expect to see, some names perhaps you wouldn't as much. And I don't know. I think with a few of them, Sam, it's a case of just kind of. I know we said earlier on that every season's got its own character, and there are always going to be players that you can kind of punt around. But you know, I think class always shows through with few players, doesn't it? Some players are genuinely just very good. Obviously, Erling Haaland and Mo Salah are good players, but Bruno, Son, Maddison as well. Even though he was at Leicester last year, I think we've kind of got the rest of the data for last year somewhere. I think maybe it's on that side actually. I think it was in the top 20 last year for XGI as well. So it's kind of some of these names are unsurprising, but Son's one to zero in on really because he was a case of, as you said, being kind of flexible with where you were, because when he moved to the 9, there was certainly kind of some naysayers who were saying, "Oh, it's just tactical. It was tactical for that one game. Richarlison's going back there because he's more physical." Blah 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 blah. But he's put the numbers up. He's done well. He was not good on the left really, and it seems that Ange's kind of hit on a system now where he's just swapped Son and Richarlison over effectively with all the injuries as well they're going on. Yeah, what do you make of these numbers so far?
Yeah, so there are some players in here where twas ever thus. Haaland and Salah at the top, no questions asked there. I think if either of us were to put bets on at the start of the season on which two would be at the top after this many game weeks or any amount of game weeks, it would be Haaland and Salah. So probably not too much point in discussing them. Ollie Watkins, I think when we move over to the next slide, he features in the top 10, but it looks a little bit lower. Whereas third in this one, I think he's 7th or 8th in the next one, but there are 2 or 3 inactive players ahead of him. One through injury, one through a transfer. So actually, in terms of active players, he would have been 5th last season for non-penalty XGI, which I think is really interesting that we've had a player that is 8 million at the start of the season that we probably have a fair bit of confidence in. And until the 23-point haul, he was still pretty lowly owned. I think it was like low 20% EOs.
Yeah, and loads sold for Alvarez as well, didn't they? Including us.
yeah, absolutely. So again, it's maybe learning a lesson on when to be slightly more patient and when to realize that the data is pointing in the wrong direction. Watkins has been in and around this chart all season long, and he was all of last season as well, ever since Emery came in last season as well. So maybe we shouldn't have ever lost faith in him and just back the fact that returns are coming. And you mentioned earlier on in the pod that we've scrutinized Marcus Rashford, but we haven't been talking negatively about Bruno Fernandes. Well, part of the reason I haven't been is because I made this slide earlier, so I knew he was going to be 4th. And actually, maybe he's a player, considering the fact that we have so much data on him from past seasons, and he's usually in and around the top 5 or top 10 at least. He's still doing it. He's still up there. So the only real reason he's not in the conversation at the moment is because he's not actually getting the physical FPL returns. He's not getting the goals. He's not getting the assists to make him an option. But the fixtures are still good. Sheffield United next up. And then after City, they've got another couple of really good fixtures as well. And maybe it's just a case of he's just been a little bit unlucky not to get more than he has. There's also a certain element of the players around him not finishing the chances that he's providing them, because he is quite assist driven. But yeah, I mean, he could easily be a player that, a bit like Ollie Watkins, a lot of us have been selling, and then all of a sudden he just explodes with a big haul and makes good on all of this good underlying data. I mean, we can talk about Decore as well, whether things have changed or not. I don't know. Everton have got really good underlying data at the moment. It's actually
they do.
Absolutely mind-boggling. Dyche's got them going, and Dyche is also now an XG merchant. He loves it. He's talking about it in all the press conferences. I absolutely love it. And that is no offense to Dyche, but the last person I'd expect to be obsessed with XG. So fair enough. So maybe Decore is an option. He's arriving in the box late, and he's almost playing as like a shadow striker at times. So maybe that's a lesson we need to learn for this season, that Everton's system is changing. They've got more creative players in there. Possibly we're underestimating them ever so slightly. I think the only other thing to mention is Everton's fixtures have been very easy on average, and they're coming into some very difficult fixtures now as well. But yeah, some very interesting lessons to learn from the top few in this list.
Yeah, not touching Everton probably. Another important lesson to learn. Lampard had him in the bomb squad, Decore. So I'm not going to go any further than that. I mean, Bruno's just an interesting one in general, isn't he? Just because, I mean, last year 8 goals, 8 assists, right? And massively underperforming on his XGI. Not massively underperforming this year so much. Actually. No, that's not true. He is. So, I mean, maybe it's just, as you said, the quality of the players around him. Like, if Rashford's not kind of doing it, Højlund's obviously still finding his feet in the Premier League. There's certainly something which isn't quite fitting in there. So maybe it would be the case if you're watching Man United, you see that Bruno's doing loads of running, getting all over the place, but it's just not quite happening at the moment. And because we're quite early doors as well, you can kind of point to a couple of situations, a couple of things where maybe that would be influencing his data to a certain extent. So there's a big header that he missed. I'm gonna say that was against Tottenham.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you've got obviously the Nottingham Forest game where he got the goal in the systems absolutely everywhere as far as I can remember. And then the Burnley game as well with a really nice sort of volley against Palace again. Yeah, lots of expected assist sort of information going on. But yeah, one that you might kind of think, you know what, okay, the rest of the team isn't quite up to his level, or at least there's no one at the moment like Martial back in lockdown, Rashford or Højlund able to quite convert yet, so it's not quite happening for him. Yeah, no, you're right. As you were spooling right back to what you're saying at the start, that if you did have to put a bet on and say, yeah, well, Haaland and Salah definitely be the top two by game week 8, then they are. And so I think there's definitely an element that, class will always show, I suppose, with Haaland and Salah in here, Bruno, Watkins, and Son too. So I think Son last year, absolutely nowhere. The annus horribilis, really. I think he was still in the top 20 last year, but definitely one that you can kind of think about a little bit. The other one to give a quick shout out to is a future Chelsea signing, Pedro Neto, who is in 13th overall, who's very, very good in the game against Villa this week. 5 assists so far this season. I think that's joint most with Trippier, I'm going to say. I think Trippier did, I don't know, doing really well.
Actually, Watkins is down at like 7 assists FPL wise, I think.
Oh, yeah, of course, there's FPL assists on there, but
assists,
true assists, I suppose, yeah. And then Jared Bowen, who's 10th there, he's actually 3rd for goals scored this season behind the Haaland, Son, Isaac, who appear on this list, and Bowen. There's also a character who has 5 goals too, which we'll speak about next week on the pod. I think that's okay. But let's look at last year though, where we ended up. What's missing here, and who are we still there? So, one person who's currently out of the picture completely is Harry Kane, who finished 4th, 23.7. Erling Haaland, Salah, and Fernandes were the top 3. De Bruyne, who obviously been crocs most of the season, was in 5th. Rashford in 6th. Ollie Watkins in 7th. Martinelli, Tony, and Odegaard made up top 10. Obviously, Tony has missed the first half of the season and will be at Arsenal, it seems like, by January. So it'll be interesting to see. One thing that strikes me here immediately, Sam, Arsenal players.
Yeah.
There are currently none at the moment in the top 10. For this year thus far. So, I mean, what's happened there? I mean, it's one of those where I think you said it really a little while ago that if one of their players, and we always expect that to be Saka. Like I still, as I said, when I was wildcarding, I still expect Saka to have a great season. I really do. If he's not giving penalties away quite literally to others. But he's 12th at the moment in terms of non-pen XGI.
Yeah.
And Odegaard's is, I don't exactly know where he is. I think he's kind of like, I'm going to say kind of in the, like 80th, something like that, like really far down. We were texting during the game, weren't we, on Sunday? And it did sort of feel like, Martinelli obviously changed things. I do love Martinelli, and I think that he's kind of oddly our best attacker in lots of ways because Saka always gets double marked.
He's so direct as well.
Something this year, because of it being kind of all patched up and players kind of dropping in and out, something's sort of missing, and you can see why kind of Tony's being kind of aimed at. I mean, I think that for me, that's the biggest takeout thus far, that we're missing. We are really missing from this, despite obviously being joint top of the league.
Yeah, agreed. And it's really interesting to see that despite Arsenal's relatively easy fixtures up until the City game, they're actually mid-table for non-pen XGI as a team. I think they're around 1.55 going into game week 8, which is a lot lower than we'd expect. Not terrible by any means, but it's definitely a flag to keep your eye on, just to make sure that they are going to start generating higher and higher XG over the next few weeks. I think it is now starting to click into gear a little bit. And I think to start with, there were maybe one too many experiments at the start of the year that maybe just slowed them down a little bit. And they've been winning games anyway, so it hasn't really impacted them as far as their charge for the Premier League title is going. But in terms of the underlying data and the fluidity of that attack, I think that maybe it was hampered a little bit. Saka, obviously phenomenal as always. I think he's great value for money. But like you say, a part of what Arsenal are looking to do this season is mix things up and have different routes to finding a way to win a game. And in the past, I think they've been maybe found out, I think is probably a strong term considering how good they were, but found out a little bit in certain games where maybe they only had a plan A and a plan B. And once those got nullified, they struggled a little bit. Whereas I think the fact that they're even linked with Ivan Toney really goes to show that they're looking for different ways to skin a cat and win a football game. And having Toney is a very different striker to having a Gabby Jesus up there. And I think the number of different types of attacking combinations and strategies they've got to break down a team, the better. But at the moment, because they're working on each of them and trying to find a way for each of them to work, that maybe overall it's hampering their progress as a team and just maybe slowing them down on the underlying data for now. For what it's worth, I think that is just going to be a momentary blip in the season, and they're going to start really kicking on now, especially after the City win. And again, things are starting to click into gear a little bit. So I do see them starting to appear in the top 10 for the XGI for this season very soon. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's shared around even more than it was last season, because I say, they're going to try and find different routes to goal. And where in the past we might have expected like a Gabriel Martinelli to lead the way in terms of that underlying data, don't be too shocked if you start seeing a few different players sharing it around, and overall they accumulate a very good amount of XG. But player for player, maybe it's slightly lower because they're mixing things up a little bit more.
Yeah, like the Man City of old without Haaland, where you didn't really have a talisman. You had just a homogenous blob of blue who could do goals. And it's very much about getting in the right player at the right time, taking the temperature of the kind of the season state, I guess, for the club, and thinking, right, okay, Martinelli's in a good moment, and maybe Trossard's injured. You're probably okay. It's not escaped, I think, anyone's notice that even from this week, I know they play Chelsea, but even from this week, all the way until looking at game week, looking at beyond next year, but all the way up to Christmas, basically, they have got. I'm going to say they. We've got Newcastle in game week 11, and then Liverpool in game week 18. But the rest of the games, it's just a ridiculous run. So individuals like yourself who have left room for a Arsenal player on your wild card, and individuals like me who probably need to be thinking about how to get an Arsenal player on their wild card. It impacts people differently, but it's definitely something we need to be thinking about going forward. Cool. I mean, it's a really interesting subject, really. There's loads of different things that you could kind of try to throw in here and try to kind of assess. There's kind of more of a quick look, I guess, at kind of where we are with all of it. As an end question, FPL Stato, he asked, what's your biggest learning so far this season? What's the biggest thing that you think you've learned from FPL as it's been played out in front of your eyes, Sam?
Oh, we kind of touched on it earlier, but I think that ignorance phrase that I used earlier, that you should just be open to being flexible more than anything else. And I think a part of that flexibility is also having routes to the players that could become a danger to you. So having that almost like a price point draft in a sense where you know that you've got a way to get out of a certain maneuver if you need to. So I think until this past game week, I would have been really hesitant to have a 5.5 million midfielder in my team at all, because I just felt like there wasn't a way off of them or options at that price. If I got locked in with a Neto, then I'd have nowhere to go. But luckily now a few other options are starting to come out of the woodwork. So I feel like I'm much more safe to have that price point in my draft. And I think that's the lesson that I'm trying to take forward with me for the rest of the season. Like you mentioned a minute ago, I've left a very deliberate spot ready for Saka to come in game week 10. I think there might be a Martinelli shaped hole in there as well if I need there to be, which is fortunate. I genuinely didn't expect him to be back this week, and I don't think many people did. So that's potentially a nice surprise. But having routes back to the players that you think are going to be the danger, and having that mindset of looking ahead and seeing what the targetable fixtures are and making sure you're flexible to jump onto those fixtures if you need to and have the right coverage in those games, is going to be really important, especially with so many teams that, again, just feel more targetable than ever before, I would say, very slightly. I think there's 4 teams now that I'd quite comfortably say 3 or 4 goals in any given match against them right now. So I want to be able to have that flexibility in my team where I can move across to a player playing them if I need to, just so I've got that coverage. And that's probably the lesson I've learned so far this season.
No, fair play. I think for me, it's kind of the so what in the pricing, which was kind of, I don't think I quite kind of grasped that early doors. And maybe that's kind of something I should have done, or maybe that's something that's kind of been revealed to me, I guess, as the season's gone on. But I think kind of the fact that the pricing was quite level, especially for a lot of kind of players that we've both mentioned quite a lot in the midfield category, has kind of lent itself to a different play style, and also lent itself to some sort of crazy change in the transfer market. It's lent itself to EO being quite leveled as well. Like all of these things, if you can, the earlier you recognise them and get kind of an idea, it might be that the season doesn't go that way. It may be that overall, players who are currently in kind of the template to some extent, Salah, Son, maybe Bowen, maybe an Arsenal midfielder does kind of rise, and a Martinelli or a Saka does turn out to be a season keeper, quote unquote. But kind of just being aware of those things, and I think that's something that I've really kind of learned again this season at the beginning a little bit, because last season didn't really apply as much. The template was so strong, but in a season like this, where it does there's a lot of flexibility, being aware of the fact that you can be kind of turning into that flexibility as such. I think that's something that I've kind of learned a little bit this season, and I think I'm really enjoying the fact that you can do these things without too much comeuppance against you, and in weeks that we've seen as well, if the gamble does go right for you, the rewards are there to be had. So hopefully there's something there in terms of a learning that we can then take forward into other things. It might not be captain every week. It might be that Haaland does, and we've got a question of this actually, whether Haaland does kind of retain auto captaincy, but in terms of just buying individual players and just hoping to buy a ticket in the lottery, I do genuinely think I'm doing the right thing in kind of buying players like Kulusevski and all the other kind of moves that I've made. So it'd be interesting to see at the end of the season if it does sort of show through, because none of them have really sort of absolutely smashed it yet. I haven't had a Sterling moment or a Son moment thus far, but all it will take is one or two, and I'll be like, yeah, you know what, I'll dine out on that for another couple of years. But hey, there we go. So I think if we are burying stuff, Sam, for a year and coming back to it next August, I don't know. I think for me, a couple of notes that I've taken throughout this, and kind of I'll see if you agree with me. Well, I think the first one you will. It's about embracing ignorance almost, and just kind of being kind of conscious of the fact that, hey, you know what? You don't know everything at the start of the season. We can look at last season's data. It's kind of cold data, and it's a whole new season. Things are going to change. Things are not going to stay the same, with pricing, with players, with all of these other sort of elements surrounding it. We've got to kind of assume that we don't know effectively, which I think is kind of a big sort of a sea change perhaps from how we try to present ourselves as FPL content creators. I think that's something I'm going to definitely take with me into next year. I'm going to try to remember this, or at least I think it's probably definitely worth us sort of picking up on this, Sam. I think next season in pre-season, do remind me if we're still around. If not, I'll get the AI robot to tell me. Yeah, I think that's really important. As I mentioned, second thing, every season is very different, which may necessitate tweaking your play style. Like, I'm not, if you are a conservative manager like you are, Sam, I'm not saying you suddenly start, mavericking it up, taking -4s every week, but maybe as you've acknowledged yourself, just having that sort of openness to, and maybe thinking, okay, this season looks like one that does lend itself to being a bit more loosey-goosey with making transfers early, with taking punty picks in. I think that's probably all right. I think the final thing as well for me is that class will always show through. So yes, there are sort of players who around the peripheries, around sort of, midfield 3 and 4, around striker 2 and 3, and around the defence, who are going to flit in and out. But if you're looking at the XGIs over kind of where we are now and where we've been in the past, it was really striking how many of those names are just familiar. We're kind of zeroing in on the likes of Abdoulaye Doucouré and Nicholas Jackson being weird individuals, and Isaac as well to a lesser degree. But the rest of them, you're not going to be too surprised. Yes, okay, Maddison wasn't there last season, but he was there and thereabouts, moved on to a better team. Again, reflecting the point you made earlier on about teams changing. So there is kind of this idea that form is temporary, but class is permanent. So I mean, they're not exactly revolutionary things to be telling ourselves, perhaps in a year's time, but they are things which are very good to just underline, highlight, and remind ourselves as we kind of next year equip ourselves ahead of a new season. I mean, anything else you'd add? Does that sound about right?
No, that sounds perfect. I think just being open to being wrong is the key thing to take into every new season. Like, you're not going to get everything right, and if you did, you'd win FPL at a canter, and no one ever does that. So you're going to get things wrong during the season. Be open to that, and don't just stick your head in the sand if things start going wrong and pretending that you were right all along. Because if you do that, you'll just go far too far down the wrong path, and you need to be open to that change. And that's something that I need to do better at as well. So yeah, I think if I'm talking to myself in the future right now, Sam, you're wrong. Stop doing that thing that you're doing right now, and change your strategy immediately. That's why you're 5 million. So yeah, there you go, future Sam. Do better.
Right, fair play. All right, and a few more questions just to end up. I know we've kind of run over a bit. I just say, I know we've got loads of questions in for this week. We're going to postpone them to next week. So thanks to Goops, Adam Pritchard, Black Wolf, FPL Sponge, Dave, Seeking Duzan, and we will be with you soon. But I think this week I kind of kept 3 because I think they're quite good for just kind of rounding off this sort of idea of kind of having quite a kind of a step back, a macro view of where we are. So first question, Liam asks, after 8 weeks, how much do you care about EO? Are you still looking at it all the time, or are you living a little? So I mean, we discussed this a fair bit this week, didn't we? Because we were talking about our captaincy offline, and we were both kind of a bit sort of discussing on different philosophies on EO. But I think the kind of the point for me and for you is even though we see EO a little bit differently, it's such an inalienable part of how we play this game now, unfortunately. And it's a case of just sort of embracing it and just kind of seeing it as a thing, not necessarily being cowed by it, as we discussed earlier with the likes of Rashford and co having high EOs, but maybe kind of being, it's all right, I'm going to move on. But I think it's still important, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's all about exposure to risk, effectively. And I think the conversation we came down to was the assumption that Son would actually be over 100% EO, which he never actually ended up being in the first place, which was a lovely surprise. But it became a question of, would you prefer to put the armband on Son because then you're celebrating his points as well as Salah's points, who was undoubtedly going to be under 100% EO? Or do you still back Salah knowing that you get, well, in the end, he was about 40% EO. I didn't think it'd be that low, but let's say you get 150% of his points versus just 50% of his points if you didn't captain him. And I don't know how common this is, and this probably doesn't make mathematical sense, but the way I've always looked at EO is you've got 12 players in your team that account for 12 sets of 100% EO. You can either
including
have,
captain.
11 plus one that has 200.
Yeah, best to explain that. Just so people are like, what are you talking about?
Sorry, I should have probably mentioned that at the start. So you've got 11 players plus 12 for the captaincy. 11 of them have to be 100% EO in your side, in your particular side, and then one will have 200% effective ownership. So that is your exposure to the landscape of all of these 600 odd players that could play in the Premier League that week. Obviously, there are therefore 600 odd players that you don't have any EO in, you don't have any ownership of, and each of them will have a combination together of 6,000 odd percent or 60,000 odd percent EO in combination across the game. Most of these players will have absolutely no ownership whatsoever. We 0.001 EO, and so we don't take any notice of them. But the ones that we do start taking notice of are where it creeps over like 20-30%, and your exposure to that is a 20% of their points are going to hurt you. So I think the question we were asking at the time is, would you prefer to be able to celebrate Son's goals a bit because you are doubling up, you've got 200% of a player, and hope that he does well, but then also you get much less exposure on Salah? Or do you just back the player that you fundamentally think is a very marginal, but in our view, a slightly better pick that week, get the 100%, 150% effective ownership gain over the average, because the average was at 50% and you're at 200, and take that win, hoping that it pays off and it goes phenomenally well, which luckily for us it did, but obviously it could have gone the other way, and we could have been, if Son's ownership was just over 100% ownership, a little bit annoyed at the fact that even though we own a player, he's returning and it's actually hurting you. So I don't know where you, well, I kind of do, but for the
do you know exactly where I stand on this?
For the sake of the
several voice messages were sent.
Yeah. For the sake of the listeners who weren't privy to our private text chat, how do you stand on this?
I see where you're coming from. It's a really nice way of looking at it. I think it's a very optimistic way of looking at it. I take the other side where I'm a little bit more cynical about it, where I kind of see that if a player's 100% EO, like, they're gone. It's all over. It's fine, and I think what you mentioned about kind of Son as well. We were both kind of nerdily quite happy that he was under 100% EO because we both got gains from him. But if you've got Haaland, who's always going to be above 100% EO, you've got another player who comes in who's the captain of the flavour of the week. So you've got two players who are 100% EO. They're basically gone from your team. So you're playing with 9. This week we played with 10. Is how I look at it. You look at it, it's kind of like you're playing with 11, but the EO kind of moves around within that. I kind of just take them out of the equation in my mind. Maybe that's just me being cynical. Maybe that's just kind of it's just another way of looking at it basically. And I think it kind of comes from a perspective of just hating the fact that I need to hope that players that I actively own don't do anything. This week was a lot easier because Haaland was playing my team. But if you're in a situation where, say, you own, I don't know, you own another player, you own that in a different game that isn't kind of emotionally involved with that game, it's set for FPL. It's rubbish to be rooting against players that you own, and it's rubbish to go into a game with 9 people. It's good, because I guess taking your kind of philosophy in mind that you've got kind of less EO to deal with, so those players can do more for you. It's just that I just don't like kind of starting off on the back foot effectively, which is kind of how I see having 9 or 10 players. But I completely appreciate where you're coming from. I do think that it's a really nice way of looking at it. I wish I could be convinced to clothe myself in the comfort blanket of looking at it that way. It's just that I'm naturally a little bit more cynical than you, Ted, and I think it's just one of those things that I look at and just think, that's not good that I've got 9 players this week. Whereas you'll be looking at it going, oh yeah, that's fine, that's great. There's loads of kind of space to move on. I think it comes down to manager type ultimately. But answering the question, I think we both care about it, and I kind of wish I didn't know about it, because I think it would kind of mean that my decisions would be different on a lot of occasions, like in terms of signing players, in terms of doing things. I think it's important to kind of acknowledge it. It's there. It's a way. It's kind of the key mechanism for how you do well or don't do well. But it shouldn't completely sort of dictate your decisions. I'm not one of the purists who are saying just captain the player you think will score the most points. I think there's always got to be an element of thought which goes in, which acknowledges EO. But sometimes, yes, it's good to live a little. And coming off this week, we've obviously enjoyed the benefits of living a little. But if Son had scores and Son had outscored Salah, then we'd both be sat here thinking, well, maybe we should have kind of adhered to EO a little bit more. A lot of it's kind of quite transitional depending on where you are in the season. But no, I think it's definitely an interesting point, and maybe one we can kind of come back to later on in the season, especially when there's a week where the expected EO, the XEO, is going to be again quite contentious. Second question. We've kind of alluded to this a couple of times. Sean, FPL Death Star, and Nate Jacobson. As Salah and Haaland owners, are you ever tempted by captaining Salah above the robot going forward? So you both did very well this week. Should we be less hesitant, says Sean, to zag after this week's successes? I think this is one which is quite interesting because obviously there are loads of people now taking the no Haaland route.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's a question: is it now time where auto Captain Haaland, the service is kind of has come to a halt for a little bit? Because you've got, if you look at the FDR, difficult fixtures ahead: 3-4-2, 3-4-3, 3. But if you look at the actual fixtures themselves, Brighton at home, Man United away, Bournemouth at home, Chelsea away, Liverpool at home, Spurs at home, and Aston Villa away. Really, none of them are actually worrying, are they, Sam? I mean, I was very cynical about these, about removing Haaland, and cynical about removing Alvarez when you interviewed me when I wildcarded. I mean, I don't know. I do think that I'm going to be captaining Haaland. Spoilers this week ahead, barring injury. I don't know. I do think last week was like a pick your battles sort of moment, whereas kind of for the foreseeable now, I'm sat there thinking, yeah, I'm almost definitely captaining Haaland for most weeks going forwards. I mean, what about you? Where are you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm to answer the question directly, I'm open to it. I'm always open to the idea, but the situation needs to really balance in the favour of a Salah or a Son to make me want to do it. I'm not going to be selling Haaland anytime soon. In terms of Salah versus Haaland or Haaland, as you pronounce it, I don't actually know which is technically correct, so I vary between one and the other wildly. I think this week it's Haaland, personally. Brighton at home just seems like a great captaincy fixture for him, so I won't be taking that chance this week. But there are weeks ahead where you could arguably be looking at Salah. Salah's got some great fixtures to come. Son does as well. Even Saka at some points could arguably, if he doesn't give away any more penalties, could arguably be someone you could take on Haaland with. But overall, I still think he's a great captaincy option most weeks. And I think in at least 3 or 4 of the next 8, I'm looking at potentially captaining him. So when I was wildcarding, obviously there was a lot of talk around the community about some people taking him out. I completely respect the idea of doing it. I just don't think that I could have gotten enough extra value elsewhere in my team by removing that 7 million from Haaland to take it down to an Alvarez to make it worthwhile for me. And then I also didn't like the idea that I'm quite a panicky manager. If there's a player that's got really high EO, doing really well and captained by everyone, and he's exploded once in the last couple of weeks anyway, I know in myself I'm going to be very tempted to want to get him back. And if I'm committed to no Haaland draft, I've got 7 million spread in 3 or 4 different positions that I would need to somehow bring back to upgrade an Alvarez or a Watkins to Haaland as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't have that temperament as an FPL manager to just stay the course and keep going without a player that I, at the end of the day, fundamentally believe is the best asset in the game. So yeah, it's just not for me, but I can see myself not captaining him at times over the next stretch of fixtures when there are very, very good fixtures for the likes of Salah or Son. But I think there's still plenty of captaincy opportunities for Haaland to come.
Yeah, I mean, I'm broadly with you there. I think it kind of comes back to what the reason I included the question about EO here is because there's always going to be that feeling in me that if I captain Haaland, I've basically still got 11, 12 players that week. If I captain someone else and I'm not convinced of the fixture, with Arsenal, that's a fixture that I'm like, you know what? I don't think Haaland's going to score there. But in other weeks, I'm not really in the same boat. I'm not really thinking, yeah, there's little chance that Haaland's going to do something in this game. And the predictions, at least in my mind, and then you add the model stuff in, which kind of obviously kind of slightly changes things. But in my mind, I always think, you know what, it's just better to kind of have a game full 10. So the rest of my players, because Haaland just sucks the EO up, are always going to be under 100% EO. They're always going to score me points, and then I've kind of got Haaland there for safety. That's kind of the way I look at it. But you're right, there are a lot of game weeks coming up where you look at it and you think, you know what, all right, there's probably scope to take Haaland on here. Problem is that next week, Brighton at home, Salah's got Everton at home, Son's got Fulham at home. Okay, fine. I'm going to go with Haaland there. And then you get to game week sort of 10, and Man United away. Well, I mean, Salah's got Forest at home, Son's got Crystal Palace away. Obviously, a few other options sort of out there as well. I think in game week 10, you've got obviously the Sheffield United for Arsenal, so maybe you might want to captain Saka. But what happened against Man United last year for Haaland?
Yeah,
One of the, and it's not as if they are defensively amazing at the moment. I mean, would I back Haaland to do something against Johnny Evans and Harry Maguire? I think so. I mean, I'm probably not being controversial there, but I think so. And isn't Rodri back next week as well? So,
I think that'll make a difference.
Yeah, things change a lot. Bournemouth in game week 11 at home, nailed on. Game week 12, Chelsea. All right, so Salah's got Brentford at home. You know how nasty Brentford could be to play against. Son's got Wolves away. Who have Arsenal got that week? Newcastle away. And then I'm only going to go one more. So game week 13, Liverpool at home. Salah, Man City away. Son, Aston Villa at home. Saka, where are we? Burnley at home. So maybe that's 1 week where I maybe think about it, but Liverpool are not exactly watertight. So, I mean, all of these games, none of them at the moment provide me with enough to think, yeah. And maybe it's just fair. And there's definitely a few comments, like a friend, Bernardo's Maldonado, it just feels like there's a little bit too much fear about Haaland at the moment, which I completely understand. I don't think I'd ever have the balls to just remove him. And hats off to those who have, grabbing that EV, grabbing those YouTube views. But I mean, for me, it's one of those where I'm very kind of keen to just not expose myself to that level of risk. And it's one of those things that I can't see myself doing, basically. So yeah, it's one to revisit, one to talk about next week as well, when we talk about Salah a little bit as well. But yeah, certainly an interesting topic, and one which I think, because there's been a lot of people removing Haaland this week, which is going to run in the community a little bit.
Yeah.
Final
Certainly
question.
for the next stretch of these arguably negative fixtures, I think a lot of people, like I said, are almost committed to this path now. So it'll be interesting to see what the debate changes to in 7 or 8 game weeks time, which side comes out on top.
Perfect. And final question, FPL Death Star, how are you spending international break, delving into FPL stats, or totally going off grid?
I'm off grid. I'm going to chill out for a bit because I was looking so much at stats and so much at different permutations of my wildcard draft last week because I was wildcarding. I feel just ever so slightly burnt out. Obviously, it was great to get the big green arrow going into the international break, and I feel like I need a little bit of a detox from worrying about every little decision. I think you mentioned that you felt I was very indecisive last week in particular, and I think that's because there were
non-committal's the word, I believe.
Non-committal, that was it. Yeah, don't know which is more offensive.
It's triggering.
No, it's when you call me a ditherer. That's when I started going on attack mode.
Oh, you got very, very angry.
Oh, really touched the nerve there. But no, so I think last week, because there were 15 decisions to make in my team and then also captaincy, so 16 decisions, I feel like I've made enough decisions for a few weeks now. So I just want a week off at least. I'll get back into it next week, I think, when we have another pod, and I'll start making a few more YouTube videos next week as well. But for the time being, I'm gonna chill and just relax and maybe maybe watch the England games, but other than that, just take a break. What about you?
So just ignore the fact that football exists for a little while. Obviously back next Monday for a more sort of functional preamble sort of pod, but it'd be quite chill.
Yeah.
It's coming, but it's not quite there. It's quite nice to have a weekend and this weekend was good. So kind of naturally, there's part of me kind of like, oh, I want more, want more. But it's good to kind of just take a break because it just refuels you, doesn't it? It re-energizes you for the next sort of array of fixtures. I don't know exactly. I think there is another spate of internationals at some point.
It's another 4 weeks.
Another 4 week, another attack the block sort of thing going on.
I think so.
Something to bear in mind, isn't it, for next week to discuss? Well, I mean, is it worth doing transfers and captains quickly, or should we just leave it for the time being?
Well, I've got the slide, so let's quickly maybe just go over the bus teams at the moment. I mean, no transfers so far, but this is yours first up. Anything here that you're thinking of moving this week, or is it just a roll as it stands? Obviously,
yeah, it's just a roll for me. I think there's something that maybe we'll discuss a little bit next week, but barring an injury, it's a roll and it's Holland captain for me. My team picks itself pretty much. Turner, I was very glad to see Turner played because the Luton game was obviously the game that you're kind of eyeballing as the one that you want the player to play. I mean, I found myself oddly in a situation where I've now got rotating goalkeepers, at least for a little bit, at least for the last kind of couple of game weeks. But Ariola's taking over from game week 10 and staying in goal until Christmas, effectively. So, but yeah, nothing really. I kind of think I'll captain Hollands and just probably roll it, and then in game week 10, because the fixtures in game week 10 are just ridiculously orgasmic. So I mean that'll be the time to remove Kulusevski, maybe the time to get Watkins in for the Luton game and see how it goes from there. And I assume it's the same story for you, isn't it? After a wild card, you've got to be rolling, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm looking at rolling this week. I had Gordon nestled safely on my bench for this reason. The fixtures to come are good. I really fancy him against Crystal Palace at home. I'm hoping no international break injuries occur. And yeah, I hopefully roll. Captaincy armband is on Haaland as it stands. I don't expect to change it, but you never know what happens, what could happen over an international break. So I'm open to changing things, but as it stands, looking to roll. And then I've got the money in the bank to get across to an Arsenal asset in game week 10, hopefully. And maybe even a Brighton asset around then or game week 11 as well, potentially. But we'll see where the land lies at that point, I think.
Cool. Well, there we go.
There we go. Yeah. So thank you everyone for listening. It's been quite a long pod today. We thought it'd be a bit shorter, but we just got stuck into all of the questions. So we ended up going for an hour and a half again. But we'll be back next week for another pod that previews game week 9 a little bit more in detail. We'll bring back Contemplate as well. We've got a subject lined up ready for that we can get stuck into next Monday. For the time being, though, thank you all so much for listening. We were Who Got the Assist. As always, you can find us on X at WGTA_FPL or at FPL Pricey. And you can find us both on Instagram and Threads at WGTA.FPL. And again, I'm just FPL Pricey on there. If you enjoyed the pod, if you could please do one or all of the following, that'd be great. Follow us on those socials that I mentioned. Give the pod a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to it. Or if you're watching on YouTube, which a few more of you are these days, then if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that would be greatly appreciated. It really does help get the pod out there.
Perfect. Well, thanks for listening from me as well. Back next week, as Sam mentioned, for a regular service pod previewing game week 9. We hope you enjoyed the pod and a step back to reflect. It's been quite fun to do. We hope it's just you think about the opening 8 weeks. Hope you buried a time capsule for yourself potentially as well. And we'll be back very, very soon. Have a good week. Speak to you next Monday.
Oh, it's a goal. Who got the assist? Who got the assist?